As Paul and Joy said, we are looking at this series over the summer. Share my story, share your story. We're taking time to share our stories. Some of us are doing that here, but we've invited all of you, and I would love all of you to feel that you could share a story. Sharing stories is really important for a number of reasons. Number one, it builds our faith when we hear what God is doing among other people. It encourages us that God is at work. Also, they honor God. Just sharing the stories of what God is doing is a way of giving glory to him and honor to him and thanks and praise for what he is doing and what he has done. And it's also a great way of letting other people know how amazing God is. And so the stories that we read in the Bible that we kind of published and read for years and years were initially just stories that people told to one another about their experiences with God that were passed down from generation to generation, way before they were written down. Telling each other the stories of what God is doing is a crucial part of our culture. In fact, Psalm 78 says, "Listen to my instructions and open my ears, for I'm going to speak to you in a parable or a story. I'm going to teach you hidden lessons from the past, stories we have heard and known, stories our ancestors handed down to us. We will not hide these truths from our children or the next generation. We'll tell them about the glorious deeds of the Lord and about his mighty wonders." And so telling stories has always been part of our culture. And as the guys have just said, we're going to try and do that very specifically around our 30th birthday, which is coming up in just short of a month's time. And we would just love you to do this. Now, somebody said some of these stories are going to be shared. They are going to be shared. You don't have to put your name to it if you don't want to. If that's something that you want to share without putting your name to it, that's absolutely fine. But we do, as a church community, we don't just want to hear the dramatic ones. We don't just want to hear the ones from the people who are the loudest. We want to hear what God is doing among all of us as a community. So no story is too small. Every story is significant. Please do take this away. In fact, don't take it away and forget. Fill it in today and put it in the box at the back. I know a couple of people have done that. I watched a load of people take them away with them last week. I've been checking up to make sure you brought them. No, I haven't really. I can't check up and see if you brought them back, but I would encourage you just to do that. Last week, Paul shared his own recent story about pilgrimage and about the fear of the Lord. And I wanted to take today and next week to share some things that God has been showing me over the past year or so. Although I'll be sharing a number of Bible passages in particular, and if you've got a Bible, you might want to look up Ephesians and chapter 3, because we will be going there a little bit. I'm not doing what I normally do, which is to teach a specific Bible passage in depth this morning. And that's deliberate because I do want to share just a bit more of my own personal journey, alluding to what God is showing me and what's in the Bible. I trust that will be helpful and encouraging as we go. If you know me, you will know that this, for me, has been one of the most challenging years of my whole life. In November, just before Christmas last year, I was diagnosed with a, get this, high-grade B-cell non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. That's what the doctors call it, or a cancer of the lymph cells in my blood. And I've been through about 4 or 5 months of chemotherapy, which was pretty tough physically and emotionally, and affected our family as well, and Joe. I am incredibly and humbly thankful and grateful that in my case the treatment has worked and the cancer's in remission. And although it hasn't been easy, truthfully, I have felt like God has walked with me at every stage and taught me some life-changing things. And I'm not really doing this as a trailer, but I'm going to talk about that properly next week. Next week I will focus and share specifically on some of that journey and some of my reflections on the suffering and challenge. Today what I want to do is pull back a bit wider to look at the context of what God has been doing in my life over this year, of which cancer, believe it or not, has only just been a part. All of us go through seasons of growth on our spiritual journey, and it's helpful to identify the season we're in. You know, if you've ever talked to a sort of... I'm trying to think of the proper phrase. I call them wooey people. But, you know, like a spiritual director or somebody, they will say, what season are you in? And it's important to acknowledge I'm in a winter season. This is cold and hard and challenging. Or I'm in a summer season and this is joyful. Or I'm in a spring season and new things are starting. For me, this has been a 5-year season, going back to 2019, which for me was a milestone year because I celebrated my 50th birthday. We'd been here at the church for coming up for a decade, And we had no intention of going anywhere else or anything like that. But I felt as if it was a significant moment, a significant year for me, a pivotal year, and one in which God was going to give us fresh vision and he was going to set us up for the next season. And one particular verse that really struck me in that time was this from Psalm 71. It feels like a pivot verse. It says, God, you've taught me from my earliest childhood, and I will constantly tell others about, I've missed a bit out. Oh, sorry, I'm going to read it in this translation. Since my youth, God, you have taught me, and to this day I declare your marvelous deeds. And even when I am old and grey, do not forsake me, God, till I declare your power to the next generation and your mighty acts to all who are to come. So I love the idea of this verse. It sort of says to me, okay, for me it felt symbolic because I was 50 in that year. But to be honest, this is true however old you are and whatever's going on. But for me it felt like all my life up to that point had been a case of learning from God and being formed and being shaped by God. And as I turned 50, I felt that God was doing something else and saying, now I'm going to use you to proclaim my power to the next generation. And it just felt like a pivotal verse. And that's not just for me, that's a universal truth. It's actually true for anyone. Anyone who has been invested in by God and has something to share. I'm not saying you have to wait till you're 50 to be any use or to be able to invest in other people. That's not the truth. But it just felt like, for me, that verse was key. And something else that happened was somebody gave me a picture, a word on my 50th birthday. And they said God was going to give me a new rod and a new staff, like the shepherd in Psalm 23, a newer, bigger rod of authority and staff of leadership to replace the ones that I had grown familiar and comfortable with. And so I thought, well, that's quite a challenging word. God is clearly going to do something. It's 2019. I am excited about what God's going to do next year. We launched into 2020. I was all set for God to do some really brilliant, exciting new things. And as we know, 2020 didn't really go like that for most of us because there was a global pandemic and everything changed. And so instead of forging ahead with vision and energy, the pandemic happened and everything changed overnight. And all of us were required to think carefully and change what we were doing and how we were doing life. And for us here, it felt as if we were reinventing pretty much every 2 or 3 months how we did church, what that looked like, how we related to one another, how we continued to worship. And so all that was going on. And then later in 2020, later that year, I was also I found I got some symptoms of what effectively was diagnosed as a heart condition, a coronary heart disease. And so I couldn't actually do much exercise anymore because I'd get really out of breath and I'd get chest pains and I was often exhausted. And basically the next 2.5 years went like that. I mean, I wasn't completely disabled. I could do a load of stuff. But with the COVID pandemic and then a heart condition, I felt myself severely limited in what I could do. It was frustrating and it was deeply challenging. And I was trying to work out how to, number one, hold on to God in the midst of this process. And number two, trust that he knew what he was doing. And number three, learn to live at peace within the limitations that seem to have been imposed on my life. And that led me to questions like, have I heard God wrong? That word about a larger rod and staff and increased authority, nothing feels like it's happening like that. I feel like my life has decreased and limited, not increased in any way. When is God going to give me this new authority, this new lease of life? Has he actually failed to keep his promises? And what does that mean for me? I'm sure I'm not the only person who has had those thoughts or those questions in their mind. I'm sure that that's something that many of us have experienced, things that we are hoping and dreaming for that just, for whatever reason, haven't come about. They're not happening. Frustration and disappointment because things we thought God had said don't seem to be coming to pass. And the question is, what do we do in those moments? How do we deal with those questions? What choices do we make? How do we worship authentically? How do we communicate appropriately with God? And how do we process our feelings? And just one for the blokes here. Blokes, we're not that good at processing our feelings, most of us, are we? Nobody's like nodding or anything at me, so that's fine. So yes, Nigel, that's true. We're not very good at processing our feelings. And we're quite good at just going, don't really know. Okay. That's not to say that all the women are good at it either, but, that's a sweeping generalization. Anyway, moving on before I dig myself into a big hole. I just want to encourage you that you're not alone if that's something that you're feeling or experiencing, because there are many of us who have had that kind of experience. And for me, what I found is that God is faithful and God is present. And okay, we have to figure out how we relate to him. We have to figure out how we process our feelings. But God is there. And I spoke to this about 3 weeks ago, talking about the road to Emmaus. Jesus is always walking with us, even if we don't recognize him. Even if we can't see him or see what he's doing, he is there. And if you missed that talk, it's on YouTube and you can catch up. And so if that's your current experience, number one, I hope that today's talk encourages you. And number two, we would love to pray with you after the service today, or at the end of the service today. So I'm in the middle of this period of questions and confusion and limitations, and I'm able to work, but I'm not physically 100%, and I'm waiting to see what's going to happen medically and what the doctors are going to do. But I'm left with all these big questions about what the next part of my life would look like, and when this promised season of growth and or whatever would actually kick off. And eventually, after about 2.5 years, the medical process led me towards a heart bypass operation, which happened last May, and which for me felt like a really big deal. I'm somebody who in 53 years had never even spent a night in a hospital, and I was quite freaked out by the idea of going in for a big operation and staying there a few days. But it went great, and God was with me, and as I recovered from the operation, and I was planning my way back to health and fitness, physically and spiritually, I decided that I was going to do something that I thought about for a while, and that's something called an Ignatian retreat. Now, if you don't know what that is, I'll explain it, and it's not something that everybody has to do, but that actually became the way in which God used this year of 2023 and 2024 to completely, and I mean completely, transform my relationship with him. And that's the context that's the context in which the cancer diagnosis happened, which I'll talk to you about next week. So what is an Ignatian retreat? Well, St. Ignatius was around in the 1500s. He was a Spanish priest, and he developed a whole load of meditations and prayers and contemplative practices to help people deepen their relationship with God. And he was part of founding an order of priests called the Jesuits. And this was a way that he would help people to really deepen and develop their relationship with God. And so for centuries, people have been doing this Ignatian retreat. And the way that most people have done it over the centuries is to take 30 days out of their life, to literally stop everything for 30 days and to spend 30 days meditating, praying, and reflecting. Now, mostly in solitude and silence. Most people these days don't have 30 days to give. And so they've developed a way of doing it, which is the way I did it, which is instead of taking 30 days out, you take 30 weeks out, and you do it as what they call a retreat in daily life. And so I spent about 9 months honestly, it sounds grand, but I was just working through this book, and I had a spiritual director who I met with once a week on Zoom and just chatted through and reflected what God was doing and saying. And the sort of shape of the retreat had 5 parts to it. And these are the sort of themes and direction of the readings and prayers. Took me from a preparation where I'm encountering the unconditional and creating love of God, and then experiencing the mercy of God, looking at sin in the world, accompanying Jesus on his mission, what it looked like to be Jesus on earth, incarnated, then being with Jesus in his suffering and savoring his compassion, and then experiencing the joy of his resurrection. And why did I do this now? Well, I've been meeting with a spiritual director actually for about over 5 years. Now, a spiritual director is just somebody who helps others to reflect on their journey with God. You don't need a spiritual director to help someone reflect on your journey with God. It's something we could actually do quite easily for one another. It's simply about making a space to listen to somebody, to hear the story and hear the heart, and help them see what God might be doing. And that's something we can do for one another quite easily just by putting aside some time. But this is something that the Vineyard Church is offered to senior pastors like Joe and I in order to just invest in our spiritual health. And I found that incredibly helpful. And so I carried on. One of the reasons I found it very helpful is, if you know me, you'll know this. I'm an external processor, which means I tend to work out what I'm thinking as it comes out of my mouth. And that isn't always the most helpful and best thing to do. And so a safe space to do that was really helpful, because my spiritual director would listen to me and reflect things and ask me some pointed questions. And doing this has helped me to build and maintain some really good habits that have led to a life-giving relationship with God that remains and has to remain vital and at the center of everything I do. You see, as a pastor particularly, this is true for anybody, but as a pastor particularly, there's a real temptation to become, to use quote marks, a professional Christian. Somebody who does the job and loves Jesus because that's what I get paid to do. And I want to avoid that at all costs. I didn't get into this for a job. I got into it because I love Jesus. And because following Jesus and following everything that's happened, following Jesus has been the story of my life. And I feel like God's called me to share that with other people. And so because of all that's gone on over the last few years, I just kind of want to do things that help me stay in love with Jesus. I have a quick challenge for you. Can you complete this sentence? The grass is always greener. No, you're not right. The grass is not greener on the other side. The grass is greener where you water it. Ooh, think about that for a minute. There's a sermon in there, isn't there? There's a sermon in there. Everyone says, oh, the grass is always greener on the other side. I'm looking forward to somebody else. It's not true. The grass is greener where it's watered. That applies in any relationship, just like in marriage. Our marriage works when we invest in it. Our friendships work when we invest in them. And our relationship with God works and grows when we invest in it. And so the more I intentionally invest in my relationship with God, the more I'm going to grow. And I especially want to finish well. I want to avoid the pitfalls that some leaders seem to get into towards the latter part of their life, which causes them to lose sight of who they are and make poor choices. I am not interested in finishing my life like that. And so Joe and I had previously done a 10-week version of this retreat while we were on our sabbatical. Even the 10-week version I found scary. The idea of having to read the Bible every day and answer to somebody and tell them what I'd thought. I mean, I know I'm a pastor, but that's pretty scary. But I actually loved it, and I felt closer to Jesus during those 10 weeks than any other time that I can think of. I found it so life-giving that when I was recovering from a heart operation, I was thinking, do you know what? I really want to do this 9-month retreat in daily life. I really want to do it. I want to commit to it. I want to go for it. So I signed up and I committed. And I had no idea that just 6 weeks into that program, I'd be diagnosed with lymphoma. But more about that next week. I can tell you about the program I did. But if you don't have 9 months or even 10 weeks to invest in an Ignatian spiritual exercises program, that's fine. There are plenty of other things you can do. There are plenty of other things that we can do to follow a journey with Jesus. But what I want to share with you is just a little bit about what Jesus did and how God spoke to me through that year. A number of things happened. And I just finished this thing in June. And so part of finishing up was to reflect on the year and think about what I had really learned and experienced. I developed some habits which I suspect, I know, and I really hope and I'm planning will be part of my life for the rest of my life. One of them was just to sit quietly, regularly, and pray and reflect and read the Bible. Now, I'm somebody who spent a lifetime feeling guilty for not being able to have a quiet time. Okay? But I've learned that it's possible. I've learned to just be. I've learned to resist the temptation to do stuff. That's a big one. I've learned techniques for just how to read the Bible reflectively, and I've learned some prayer tools like the prayer of examine, which Paul mentioned last week, which is a very simple and very old prayer, which is just very easy to pray, just a simple structure to work through in our heads that really helps us connect with God. And one of the most important things I've been doing is to journal, write down the things that God is saying. I have a number of notebooks now from the last few years where I've just written down and I scroll it. I don't think anybody else will ever read it. I sometimes don't even ever read it myself again, although I do. I make a point of going back through my journals, try to once a year at least, just to read. I mean, I don't write in a very neat way, but actually just for me personally, again, because I'm an external processor, I find that writing things out helps me to think about and crystallize what I'm doing. But if I was to summarize the whole year, and that's what my spiritual director asked me to do, she said, what have you learned? I said, I can summarize it in 4 key themes. Over 32 weeks of readings and reflections and spending time with God, I feel like God did 4 things with me. Now, because I like words and I'm a preacher, I've found that they all began with D as well. Or rather, I twisted them around to make them all. But I found that what God was doing was digging deeper, was dealing with cancer, was discerning calling, and was discovering Jesus. And those were the 4 things that over 32 weeks of this year God has done. Now, discovering Jesus, you've already heard about some of that stuff because I've been preaching and it'll come out in all my talks. The discerning calling thing is really for me to reflect on. The dealing with cancer is what I'm going to talk about next week. And for the rest of this morning, I just want to talk a little bit about digging deeper foundations. Or another phrase you could use to this would be, God has taught me about the slow work of God. Let me give you an illustration. Here's a TV program that I watched about 2-3 years ago. It's on iPlayer still. This is a picture of a miner digging a very deep shaft. That shaft is going 32 meters into the ground. It's in London, and it's underneath the very famous and quite posh Claridge's Hotel. Anybody ever been there for a cup of tea or dinner or something? I haven't. Nobody's going to admit to it anyway. It's a super posh place. It's a super posh place. This is at Claridge's Hotel in Mayfair in London. And they had no more land. It's been there for almost a century, I think. Certainly built in the 20s or 30s. It's very Art Deco. It's super posh, and there's lots going on. But they had no more land, being in Mayfair in the centre of London, to expand. And so in order to expand, they did a couple of things. They went up 2 floors, and they went down 5 floors. And in order to go down 5 floors into the London clay, they had to come up with some absolutely groundbreaking engineering solutions. Now, I'm looking around, and about 4 of you who are engineers, your eyes are popping because you're going, oh, wicked, right? My dad was a civil and structural engineer. I have no real expertise or interest, but I watched this and I thought of him. And basically what happened is, in order to create these 5 additional stories, there's a plan view of what they were going to do. In order to do that, they had to dig out, but you don't just dig down because there's a load of clay there and the hotel is sitting on the clay. So they had to come up with this really interesting solution. So they don't just dig down. What they do is dig 64 columns. There's a sort of model view of what it was going to look like. They actually dug down 64 different columns, each column 2 meters in diameter and going down 32 meters, right? And they had to dig these things out and then fill them with concrete. And then that would be what the hotel sat on, okay? Now, in order to get that done, because this whole project from start to finish took 7 years. And the digging part took 2 years. And the hotel owners insisted that the hotel continue to function as normal above ground because they couldn't afford to stop. So their digging had to be done in a way that didn't disturb anybody, which means it had to be done by hand. So that picture I showed you is of those miners digging down 32 meters, 2 meters wide, 64 times. They hired miners from Ireland who were used to doing this sort of thing, who knew how to dig this stuff out, got rid of the dirt. All of the dirt went out through 1 4-meter square gap at the back of the hotel and then got taken away. It is crazy. It's absolutely crazy. You can watch this on iPlayer for yourself, okay? In order to not disturb, all of this had to happen. I've actually got, so there's that guy digging, okay? Usually there were 2 of them. Here's what, once they dug those columns out, which took 2 years, then they could fill them with concrete. The hotel sat on them, and then they could start digging out around to make the space. And they did that 5 times over the next year to put 5 levels in. So you've got all these columns there. That's what it looked like. And when they finished it, this is what the fancy schmancy, not that one. This is what the fancy, I've missed it. Where's it gone? That one. This is what the fancy schmancy, sauna, pool, and gymnasium looks like now. You can see where the columns are. Okay? Have a little look at this video. It's just a clip, which I found on YouTube, using some of the footage. I think it's absolutely fascinating. Have a look if you can play that, guys.
The aim of the project was to delve a basement as deep as the hotel soars high, spanning over 6,000 meters squared across 5 impressive levels. The subterranean marvel boasts a wealth of decadent amenities. It would include the hotel's very first swimming pools, a 650-meter squared spa, and an underground wine cellar housing the finest vintage wine. Also located in the basement would be a bakery and an in-house chocolatier. And for the hotel staff, this underground haven offers a complete experience with a full-service catering kitchen, restaurant, lounge area, changing facilities, showers, and laundry, all designed for luxury and comfort. The excavation and construction of the basement was carried out by a large project team. Construction crews worked 24 hours a day in 12-hour shifts, including miners from Donegal, Ireland. These miners were selected due to their expertise and their knowledge in some of the world's biggest underground engineering projects, including the Channel Tunnel and the New York subway. 2 miners worked together in one hole, and to avoid disturbing the guests above, with all the work needing to be done by hand. The first phase involved digging a network of tunnels beneath an 80-year-old concrete reinforced slab, just 2 meters underneath the guest floors and across the width of the Art Deco wing of the hotel. Then the miners began to dig vertically to create the foundations of the basement. The miners had to hand dig down 32 meters for each of the 64 piles used, 64 times. Then they had to remove 45,000 tons of dirt from beneath the hotel. Initially, all materials going in and out of the site had to pass through one single 2.5 meter wide hole at the back of the property. Once each pile was completed, concrete foundations were poured, and then 23-meter deep columns supported the hotel's original concrete slab. After 2 years of hand digging and the hotel successfully supported on the new columns, this then allowed construction workers to perform a top-down excavation of the earth around the columns to create the new 5-story basement. Removing 5,000 cubic meters of earth from each of the 5 levels was made easier using heavy machinery that was assembled in the basement. After the earth had been removed, thousands of tons of reinforced concrete were poured to form the floor and the ceiling of the floor below. After only a year, the excavation team were able to successfully dig to the 5th underground floor.
Yeah, and if you want to watch the rest of that or see the story of that, it's all on iPlayer on the Mayfair Hotel Mega Build. Now, I just thought it was interesting. I'd watched that anyway a couple of years ago, and as I was reflecting with my spiritual director, I realized that this was a really fantastic metaphor for what God had been doing and has been doing and wants to do in each of our lives, which is to dig some foundations.
The aim of the project was to delve...
Sorry, didn't want that. In order to create more space in the hotel, they needed to dig out an underground extension. But in order to do that, they needed a lot of long, slow digging. A lot of long, slow digging. And the digging happens under the ground. It strikes me that the work to dig out those columns is slow and undramatic. And yet, after just 2 or 3 years, the hotel is on absolutely solid foundations with tons of extra capacity. And I just thought that was a really powerful metaphor. That analogy spoke to me really clearly. I mean, imagine, I don't know if I'll ever even visit that hotel. Can't imagine many people visiting all those underground spaces. And yet, they'll carry on above ground as if nothing happened. And yet this deep work to dig out the foundations has gone on. 1 Corinthians 3:11 says, no one can lay any foundation other than the one we already have, which is Jesus Christ. And it seems to me that the slow work of God to create room below the surface of our lives involves spending significant time in the slow work of digging by hand deep below the ground. And so each week for me, as I went through this retreat, there were several Bible passages and verses to reflect on and read on. And one that struck me in particular was this from Ephesians 3. And this is quite a well-known passage. It's a prayer that Paul prays for the Ephesians. And I think it's a beautiful model, actually, of loving connection with God. This came up in my first week, and it's something that I noted and reflected on and read. He starts this passage, "For this reason, I kneel before the Father." Okay? Everything starts with worship. It's a posture of humble adoration. Now, I can't actually physically kneel very well for very long because my knees won't do it. But I'm very good. I've become very good at just sitting with God. I have an armchair that I sit in. It's in my office, which is quite a cluttered office, actually. But the chair itself is just a space where I sit with God. It's an old armchair. And it's just a space where I can try and adopt a humble and honouring and worshipful posture with God. Now, many of us have special places where we choose to meet with God. And my encouragement is, if you don't have one, think about where it is that for you represents a place or a space where you can meet with God. Paul carries on, "For this reason I kneel before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name." Paul knows who he is under God. He's defined by God. His name comes from God, from the Father. You know, I spent several years trying to work out who I was. Several years trying to figure out how to define my identity. And for me, in my early 20s, it was all wrapped up in music and worship and being up at the front. I wanted people to see and to know who I was and what I could do. And I had to learn that doesn't define me. I'm not defined by what I do. I'm not defined by what I do. I'm defined by who I am in God, who is the person who put me in the family and gave me my name. From time to time, that pops up again. But I've had to learn that visibility, which is what God seems to give some people, is different from identity. It's not about being up front. It's not about being noticed or followed or even having a regional or national ministry. It's about knowing that he is my Father and I am part of his family and that he calls me by name. A man called Jay Pathak, who leads the Vineyard in the United States, said this. He was talking to senior pastors, but I think it applies to everybody. He was talking about carving out time in the morning of each day to be with God. And he said, if you don't hear the core questions of identity answered by God at the start of each day, you will spend the rest of the day trying to get others to answer them for you. And I thought that was a particularly shrewd and astute observation. And I noticed that with this passage, the deliberate heart posture is that if you first kneel before the Father, as Paul says, in worship and adoration, that will lead to an assurance of identity. What I mean by that, in other words, is when we spend time with God, we are reminded of who we are and of whose we are. And if you sit there going, I don't really know who I am, I don't really feel close to God, I'm feeling a bit distant, or I've got stuff in my life I'm not sure about. The truth is, when we spend time with him, it doesn't have to be in the morning, I just find it's helpful. It doesn't have to be on our knees, but just putting aside time to humbly be with God. I found it's an absolute game changer. Paul continues, I pray that out of his glorious riches, he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. See, when Jesus left this earth, he promised his Holy Spirit to come and bring the power. He's got glorious riches in heaven, and he is ready to fill us with his Holy Spirit. And Paul's prayer for us is that we are strengthened and filled through his Spirit in our inner being, so that Jesus dwells in our hearts by faith. He has all the resources of his fingertips. Paul says, when you've got the Spirit inside you, that is like having Jesus in your heart, right here, dwelling, strengthening you. Does that sound like the way you want to live your life? Because it sounds like the way I want to live my life. I want Jesus living in my heart every day. I want to know that he is with me. I want to know that. I needed to know that when I faced the prospect of an operation where they were going to put me to sleep for a few hours while they broke through my chest bones, temporarily stopped my heart, and replaced 2 of my coronary arteries. I mean, does that not make you feel a bit nervous? Made me feel a bit nervous. I knew I needed to know God, and the truth is that I did know. I needed to know that Jesus was living in my heart, literally in my heart. How funny is that? That he was with me at every stage of this journey, that I could have confidence in him, and I would not be on my own. And I did know that because here's the truth, and because Paul has prayed for me and other people were praying for me and I was praying for myself, I knew that because of this truth, because of God's glorious riches strengthening me, Jesus was dwelling in my heart. And then later on that year when I found out that I needed to have chemotherapy, which would kill all the cancer cells, but also kill some other cells in my body and make me feel really ill and do really weird and random things to my body, I was again uncertain and somewhat fearful. And yet at that point, I also knew that Jesus was living in my heart. I knew it because I've experienced it already, and I knew it because it's true in the Bible. I already have a track record of living through these fears. And again, because of his glorious riches and the dwelling, the power of the Holy Spirit, Jesus is living in my heart. And so it applies to me and it applies to any of us. When any of us has something uncertain, something kicking off, something in our lives that we are nervous about or that we don't understand, whether it's a big thing or a small thing, we need to know that Jesus is living in our hearts. That he's with us at every stage of our journey, that we can have confidence in him and that we are not on our own. And that is true. Because of his glorious riches, he can strengthen us with the Spirit's power in our inner being. And that filling of the Spirit doesn't just happen in church or in a conference or in a meeting or in some dramatic encounter, although it can. The filling of the Spirit comes when we, with a humble and gentle posture, come to Jesus and quietly set aside time to be with God. He reminds us who we are and he strengthens us in our inner being. It's really important to write down our stories of faith. For me, I'd already walked through this once this year, so although I wasn't happy about it, although I was, to be honest, frustrated and a bit cross, to be honest, and annoyed with the disruption of having to deal with another medical thing. Actually, I knew that I'd already walked through something with God that felt quite big at the time, and that his power was here, and he would dwell in my heart. And the last bit Paul says is, I pray that being rooted and established in love, you may have the power, together with all the Lord's holy people, to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. This is all about love. This is all about love. And it's not just about knowing what God's love is. It's not just about being able to grasp how high and wide and how high and deep is God's love. I mean, it's amazing. But understanding it up here is not enough. When he says that you know this love, he doesn't mean that you know about it theoretically in your head. He means that you know about it because you experience it. You ask my kids about how I love them. They could describe it to you. They could tell you about the different things that I might do to show you I love them. But it's not enough for them just to describe it. They know it because they've experienced it, because they've been with me. And every time they hang out with me, they get to know it some more and they experience my love some more. And it's the same with us and God. We cannot learn about God just by reading in the Bible and just by understanding his love and then sitting there doing nothing about it. That's not how it goes. We need to know this for ourselves. And his prayer, Paul's prayer, is that you may be, it just even goes beyond knowledge, that you may be filled with the full measure of all the fullness of God. I've looked that word up in the Greek. It means fullness. It means you can't get anything else in. It means completely sort of jammed packed. It's kind of coming from a nautical term. And that is Paul's prayer for the Ephesians, that they would know the fullness of God. And honestly, my prayer for you, for all of us, is that we would know the fullness of God. Despite our circumstances, despite what's happening, I've prayed this prayer over many people. And how I want to finish this morning is by playing you a track. And the track is something that I found, and it's a group called the Psalm Drummers. They're a bunch of Christians who also play drums. And they did this they did this track, and I just found it, and it was the former Archbishop of York, John Sentamu, just praying this passage as a prayer. And so what I'd really like to do, by way of finishing this morning, is just to put that track on and allow the words to... I'm going to put this prayer up. This is the same prayer. Can you just pop one more slide on for me, Stephen? This is the same verse, but in a slightly different version. If you leave that up, and then I've just asked the guys to play the song. It's just a couple of minutes. And this is just Santamo reading and praying this prayer. And I played this to myself a number of times, probably once or twice a week. I made a playlist during my retreat in daily life. And I just allowed the words of this prayer to come upon me. I've got it on my phone so I can look it up. I've prayed it over a number of people since. And this was just one of the things that I felt like God was doing. So why don't you play the track? You can read the words, or you can just close your eyes and you can just allow the Holy Spirit to let these truths wash over us.
For this reason, I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth takes its name. I pray that, according to the riches of His glory, He may grant that you may be strengthened in your inner being with power through His Spirit, and that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, as you are being rooted and grounded in love. I pray that you may have the power to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled with all the fullness of God.
Now, like I said, you don't have to go through a specific Ignatian retreat to meet with God or to experience His love. Although if you're interested in that, you're welcome to, and I can tell you more about that. If you look up the phrase Ignatian retreat, 19th annotation, you'll find out. Where is it? This is all the stuff I've missed out because I've run out of time. If you look that up, that'll tell you about it. But to be honest, it wasn't specific. I mean, the content for this was part of the deal. But for me, it was an encouragement to put a structure in place that was just as important, if not more important for me, to really meet with God. Having a commitment and an appointment each week or regularly helped me to put aside time to do this. I've learned consistency. I've learned quiet time. I've learned just to be present. I find it very hard to do silence, absolute silence. I do it as a discipline. I find it easier to meet with God with a little bit of ambient music on in the background, just because it sort of helps my mind sort of not get focused on everything else. But basically, switching things off, putting my phone away, disconnecting, and then having a structured journey. If you are looking for a structured journey, there are Bible reading plans all over the place, or devotional suggestions. There are just 4 that I've found helpful over the years. There are tons of others out there. If you prefer a book, there's 2 or 3 books that we've used between us. If you just Google the phrase popular Christian devotional books, there's like a whole top 50 that comes up. The question is, how is God inviting us to respond today? We said that each week over the summer we would talk about a spiritual practice. Paul talks about the prayer of examine. For me, it's a practice of just sitting regularly and being quiet with God. And I find that going through a structure, be it a 1-week Bible reading plan or a 3-month Bible reading plan or a year-long Bible reading plan or even just a devotional thing that's specific. It doesn't really matter. There's tons out there to choose from. But the point is going through a structure and having somebody else to share that journey with has been absolute game-changing. Next week, I'll talk to you a bit more about the cancer specifically and how God showed me that. But that I wouldn't have met with God or dealt with that if I hadn't have been already going through this and dealing with this. Why don't we stand together?